Hi, this is Don. This is God Stuff number 5, Conversations with Friends. I am a pastor, and I love to have these kind of conversations with friends who do not share my religious background or my worldview, but that are willing to let us learn from each other and find out what we find most persuasive. Today is called Critical Moment. And if you have not watched the first 4 episodes, I think you really need to make sense of today, because today is kind of the beginning of the end. It's not the end. I'm not even sure how many more there will be, but this is where I begin to tie it all together. Judge and Jury was all about the fact that this is about what you find persuasive, what evidence you'll admit into your court of law, so to speak, and what you find the most persuasive, rather than what I can prove through science or through philosophical debate. And I think all of those things are limited that way. But anyway, it's also then looking at circular arguments. And today I'm going to be giving you a near circular argument, but it is not circular. And I'm not sure how much I'll emphasize that. Later, that might come back. We also looked at sunglasses and brick walls. What we're building here is the answer to the big questions in life. What is often referred to as mythology, as we look back at the past and how different societies and cultures and religions answered these questions. I would argue that my Christian faith in that sense is a mythology. I'm not saying that it's not true. I do believe it is true, but saying that it answers those questions. And I would also argue that for a lot of you, your scientific convictions and principles are also now a mythology, that they're being used by our culture to answer those exact same questions and try to present a narrative that answers the questions: where did I come from? Why am I here? Is there purpose and meaning in life? Is there morals that should govern my life? What happens after I die? All of those questions. And so as we want to test those questions, we're going to look eventually at a big picture stuff. Because when you're looking at a worldview, sunglasses again, one of the most important dynamics to really test is how well it incorporates all of the data. How well does it pull it together everything that you're already convinced of, that you already know is true? Does it make sense of it? Does it create a coherent whole that is persuasive to you? But then there's also very specific data points that you want to test and see how they fit in. And so for me, I want to start with that very specific data point, crisis moment, I'm calling it. As I ended last time, I told you I would definitely be an agnostic. If this was only a discussion about how do we figure out what's on the other side of the brick wall, so to speak, or if we're inside of a fishbowl made of mirrors, how do we find out where the fishbowl came from and is there a purpose, meaning for it? I would be an agnostic. I would argue that we can't figure that out. We can't know that science eventually can't quantify some of these questions and trap it all down, that eventually you come to a prime mover or an ultimate cause, that either matter and energy are eternal, and in whatever sense that you understand that is God, or there is a creator who made matter and energy and all of the laws of the universe, and science as we know it is contingent on that. These are tough questions for science or for philosophy, and I would be an agnostic, except that I think God has chosen to tell us who he is and to show us who he is. And so as a Christian, no big surprise that the way I believe he did that foremost, most demonstrably, most accurately, is through Jesus Christ, through his life, through his death, and ultimately through his resurrection. For me, that's huge. If Jesus did not raise from the dead, then my faith is groundless. That for me is the most fundamental conviction that I have. That kind of is the linchpin that starts every other conviction that I can build on from there. And again, it's a near circular argument, not a circular argument. I'm going to have to go really fast through some of this. I could talk about this for at least an hour easy today. And so if you have questions about things that I just kind of go broad brushstroke over fast, I would sure love to either answer them or point you to some good reading, either one. Because again, for me, this is something that I'm building my whole life on, my whole understanding of the world. I am genuinely convinced that this happened. When we look at the historical accounts of this, okay, what we're not going to do is the circular argument that I used before. God's word tells us that Jesus rose from the dead, and because it's God's word, we can know that he rose from the dead. The fact that he rose from the dead means that Jesus is God. The fact that Jesus is God told us that Scripture is inspired tells us that it's God's word. That's not the argument we're making today. We're starting with simply the Bible as a historical source, nothing more than that. Forget about whether it has errors, forget about whether it's perfectly accurate. Just how would we view it as a historical source, the same way that we would critically evaluate all of our other sources that we would build Roman history on, or Greek history, or Babylonian history, or any history from that general area of the world through that general period of time. And when you do that, I think it's stunning what you find. When we look at historical sources, first off, we look at them internally. What do they claim to be? And the Gospels claim to be based on eyewitness accounts. Matthew and John both claim to be actual disciples of Jesus, telling you firsthand what they saw. Mark traveled with Peter as his translator, and so he would have heard all of the stories from Peter and therefore was relaying what he heard Peter tell. And Luke is very clear that he's not an eyewitness himself, but that his account is put together carefully based on eyewitness testimony. And Luke wrote a combination book that is both the Gospel of Luke and the follow-up book, Acts of the Apostles. It's broken into two halves because of its length, and you just couldn't write really long on one scroll, but also because it focuses on Jesus first and then on the church that Jesus started second in Acts of the Apostles. But as you look at these, the internal test is they claim to be eyewitnesses. I'm going to have to just tease you on this one. They do not agree with each other perfectly, right? And if they did, you would just instantly scream collusion, and they copied each other. And it's just like any bunch of people who are being interrogated, wanting to get their story straight before we start asking them questions so that they can make it sound like everything was the exact same. They have enough differences, I think, to be credible, to make them more believable. They're giving the account without even caring about whether you're going to nitpick at order and chronology or some precise details, and yet they're incredibly consistent with what they tell you about who Jesus is, the kind of things that he taught, what he did, and they're incredibly consistent when you get to the crucifixion of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. I think that actually makes them much more compelling witnesses as they stand. There's the external test. How much do they agree with other historical sources? Again, I can't go into a lot of detail about this other than to say I am not aware of any specific place in the Gospels or the book of Acts where any historical source contradicts them in what they say happened. Now, there's a lot of places where they claim something happened and we don't have anything else to verify it or back it up, but then there's also a lot of places where we do. For example, a long time, there's an account of a riot at a theater in Ephesus. It was criticized for a long time as an example of why the book of Acts is not reliable, because we never found the temple there and we never found the theater there. Well, within the last 150 years or so, we found both the temple and the theater, and it all fits the description in Acts perfectly. But for centuries, that was used as an example of that. I'm really not aware of any place that is contradicted, and there's a lot of leading scholars who will go on the record saying there aren't any. We're going to get to another one that's very specific in a little bit that's kind of fun. Last is the bibliographic test. How many copies do we have? I mean, we're talking ancient documents that were not, typed and stored digitally. They were handwritten on papyrus or leather or other materials and had to survive for centuries. A lot of them didn't survive. When we look at all of the other things that we build our history on, say, take Roman history. Livy wrote Roman history right around that same time frame. There's a gap of about 400 years between the events that he wrote about and the earliest copies that we have. And we have about 20 copies to piece together what we have of Livy's Roman history. And we only have about 25% of what he wrote. Most of it is missing. Tacitus wrote both histories and annals. Same kind of deal. There's about an 800-year gap between when he wrote and the earliest copies that we have, and we have about 20 fragments. Thucydides wrote history that's about 400, 500 years before the time of Jesus, but there's about a 1,300-year gap between when the events that he wrote about and the earliest copies we have. We only have about 8 copies of his. When you look at the New Testament, it's on an entirely different level. Now, this alone doesn't prove that it's true, but it does say you better take it real seriously as a historical document, and you better really wrestle with what it claims. With the New Testament, we have a gap that is very small between the events that were claimed to have happened and when they were written. Now, there's some debate about that. But most of the time, the Gospels are considered to be written 30 years to a max of 70 years after the events of the life of Jesus. And not only that, but we have well over 5,250 copies, fragments. And those fragments date right back to about 100 AD. I think 106 AD is the earliest one that we have. And they get again, right up against when they were written. So from a historical perspective, we have a very high level of confidence that we actually have a very correct understanding of what the original writers wrote. Incredibly accurate. I could talk about it forever. But I want to go behind that, and I want to go somewhere that's even a little different than you might expect, to give you a sense of the historical accuracy and just how powerful the claim is. So I mentioned the book of Acts. It's the second half of Luke, Acts, both written by Luke, the historian, he's called. He is generally regarded as the one who is most modern in his approach, if I want to say it that way. Remember, this is first century. They're called Gospels, which means good news. They're not just straight biographies, not by a modern sense. They had a different cultural understanding then. They were meant to be truthful and factual, but they were also meant to convince you of something. They weren't just trying to be neutral and unobjective. When you get into Luke, he is considered to be a historian of excellence by any critical standards of that time in history. And when we get to Acts, we have since divided them into chapters and verses. Luke didn't write it that way, he just wrote one long book. But if you want to look up the Bible online on the computer, or if you have a copy of your own, you would look at Acts chapter 18, starting at verse 9 and following. And there's this episode that happens, a little detail says, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia. And what happens is something actually very typical that happened over and over again. Paul would teach. People would be convinced by his teaching about who Jesus was. Eventually, this would cause opposition and hostility. These people took Paul in front of Gallio, this Roman proconsul, to try to have Paul imprisoned or beaten or ideally killed or whatever. And Gallio just blows them off because that's what Rome did in that time. If you were creating an uprising, Rome was going to get involved with a heavy hand if you were doing anything politically dangerous to Rome. But if this was an internal matter of religion among the local, customs and codes and religious activities, they just washed their hands of it. And that's what this guy did there. Well, here's what's so important about this reference to Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia. We know very specifically from other history sources from the Roman Empire that he was the proconsul of Achaia from July of what I will call AD 51, you might call it CE, Common Era 51, to July of 52, a 1-year period. And Luke, who writes this most chronological and most detailed account, when he gets through all of this in the story of the early church in Acts, we can now pinpoint the whole chronology that happens through that whole book based around this episode with the proconsul Gallio. Now, why is that important? Again, I'm getting a little long-winded. I could talk about this for 2-3 hours. The fact that we have this grounded timeline for the events of the book of Acts lets us know that First Corinthians, the first of two letters written by the Apostle Paul to the church that he started in the city of Corinth in Greece, that first letter written to them was written in the spring of AD 55. Now, why is that important? Well, spring of AD 55, it's not very complicated math, is just a meager 22 years after Jesus is crucified. And 22 years after Jesus is crucified is when he is writing about the resurrection and saying how Jesus appeared, not only rose from the dead, but appeared in person to Peter, appeared to the 12, the disciples. He appeared to more than 500 who became followers of Christ all at the same time. He appeared to James. He appeared to all of the apostles. Last of all, he appeared to Paul himself. 22 years, and Paul says he appeared to more than 500 at the same time, many of whom are still alive. This begs the invitation, go ask somebody who saw him. Think about this from the perspective of what has happened 20 to 30 years ago, 9/11. Think about this from the perspective of what happened more than twice that long ago. Think about Elvis or the moon landing. Think about how silly you would think I was if I told you Elvis never lived. He was really just a Hollywood production figure that they kind of made up. There's actually several actors that played Elvis. That's why his appearance changed so much over the years. You wouldn't believe me for a second, right? And I wouldn't believe anybody who said that to me because I went to grad school and shared an office with a lady who grew up down the street from Elvis. That's why I use this as the story. She knew Elvis before Elvis was Elvis, and I knew her. And when she tells me, yeah, she grew up with a big crush on Elvis before he was anybody, famous or popular, I know her. I believe her. She saw Elvis. I don't need to see Elvis. I know somebody who did see Elvis. And you can do whatever you want to try to persuade me otherwise. My judge is going to look at the evidence and my jury is going to be persuaded. And I'm going to be like, really? You're going to try to convince me Elvis wasn't real? Think about the moon landing. What would it take you to convince you that the moon landing never really happened? I want you to be struck by this for a second and just think about it. 22 years after Jesus had been crucified and the claim was out that he rose from the dead, some things that never happened that could have easily happened would have been things like the Jewish leaders who arranged to have Jesus crucified could have brought out his body to just squash this whole claim that he rose again and said, here's your crucified Savior, he's still dead. That would have been the end of that. They didn't do it. There's been different kinds of accounts that have tried to explain away the resurrection of Jesus, that he didn't really die, he just passed out. Stuff like this, I don't want to be mocking, right? I really don't want to be insulting. My judge and my jury laugh at some of these explanations. If you know anything about Roman history, when you were condemned to be executed by crucifixion, you died. These were professional executioners who did this a lot. And their penalty, if they didn't finish the job, was they would be executed. They would be crucified if they didn't finish killing you first when they were assigned to do that. There's no way that Jesus was still alive when he came down off the cross. And even if he was, if you know anything, again, scientifically, historically about crucifixion, the thought of them being put into a tomb and a heavy stone being put over the entrance of somehow of coming back to consciousness and then just clawing your way out behind a stone that weighed a couple of tons and convincing everybody that you're the victor over death when you had been a bloody, beat up pulp. There's stuff like this, those kind of explanations that just don't make a lot of sense. Or that the disciples went to the wrong tomb and saw a different empty tomb and thought that Jesus therefore rose and spread that. Again, the Jewish leaders that cared enough to have him crucified and put a guard at the tomb could have so easily just produced the body and ended the whole discussion right there. there's little stories that come up like aliens actually stole his body. I'd make that one up, but I think I made it up. Somebody's probably said that somewhere. Again, I'm just not persuaded by those kind of things. I don't mean to make light of it. I do want to tell you that as somebody who I think I'm relatively intelligent, I've studied this as hard as I can. And the best explanation I can come up with is that Jesus really rose from the dead. And if that's true, then that means he's the only one ever. And it means that when he in the Gospels starts telling his disciples what's going to happen when he's crucified and that he would rise from the dead, this is, to me, seems like a pretty obvious and very serious validation of all of his claims to the disciples about who he was, what his mission was as the one who would reveal God because he was God, and the one who would deal with our sin problem, which is part of the big story that we'll talk about later. Now, you don't have to take my word for this. In fact, I would honestly, deeply, genuinely prefer that you don't. I would love it if you wanted to go challenge this and dig into it deeply. And again, I could talk about it for a long time. This is a longer talk than I normally do, because if you dig into it deeply, I'm convinced you'll be persuaded. You probably have never heard of Simon Greenleaf unless you are into law or maybe history of law, kind of things like that. He was a professor in the 1800s, founding professor of the law school at Harvard University, pretty bright guy. His specialty was what should be permissible as evidence in courts of law. That's what his specialty was in law. And he set out to prove once and for all that by those standards, the resurrection of Jesus never took place. When he dug into it, he became convinced that it actually did take place. And he wrote a book called The Testimony of the Evangelist. I'm sure you can still find a copy of it on Amazon or somewhere online. I think of guys like Josh McDowell, who is another critic who set out to disprove it and now has written multiple books explaining why he became convinced that it really happened as well. Or guys like Lee Strobel. This is one book, if you like to read books that are easy to read and pretty entertaining while you're reading them, it's called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. He was an investigative journalist with a law focus again, and became a follower of Christ as a result of looking into all of this kind of evidence. If you really want to go hardcore into this, there's a lot of good resources I'd be glad to give you, including like Craig Blomberg, The Historical Reliability of the Gospels. Do your own research, please, I beg you. And not to sound cocky, but if you consider yourself very intelligent, I would absolutely love it if you would set out to disprove the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Let your judge decide what evidence gets admitted. Let your jury have an open mind. Make up your mind for yourself, because I'm absolutely convinced this is a historical event that really did happen. And at the end of my talk last week, I said it changes everything, paradigm shift. If God chooses to tell us who he is, even though we can't trap him and figure out who he is. And I think that's exactly what happened in the life and person and resurrection of Jesus. Next step is we're going to compare some big stories, and we're going to see how they resonate. But thanks for hanging in there with me for a long one today. Hope you all are safe, and hope you're all doing well and not going too crazy with the social distancing. And maybe we'll actually get to see each other soon. God bless you.